Hello, everyone. My name is Emerson Brooking. I'm a resident senior fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab. We've just heard my colleague Jared discuss his investigation of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol and the disinformation campaign that preceded it. Many American commentators now call that campaign the Big Lie, systematic claims of election fraud spread by former President Trump and his allies that were intended to invalidate the 2020 election and place him permanently in power. That big lie has not yet succeeded in its goal. However, others have. For decades, massive disinformation campaigns, big lies, have been the cornerstone of fascist and authoritarian regimes. They've destroyed functioning democracies, enabled the murder of millions, and eventually erased history itself. By learning about big lies of the past, we can better anticipate the future. We are here to examine two less discussed big lies: the 1964 Brazilian coup d'etat, which led to a brutal 20-year military dictatorship, and the 1965 coup in Indonesia, which led to the murder of roughly 1 million supposed communist sympathizers. We're also here to discuss the rhetoric, language, and historical revisionism that binds these and all such big lies together. For this event, I'm pleased to be joined by experts from around the world. Dr. Fernanda Sanglard is a professor and researcher at the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. Dr. Wardaya Baskara is director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies at Sanata Dharma University in Indonesia. And Dr. Jason Stanley is the author of How Fascism Works and a professor of philosophy at Yale University in the United States. A huge welcome to all of you, and we're going to jump right into it. And I want to turn first to you, Dr. Sanglard. Because for our audience, for the sorts of people that the Digital Forensic Research Lab typically engages with, members of the counter-disinformation community, a lot of folks are pretty well versed in studying the internet, but we don't always talk so much about history and the historical context in which we place disinformation campaigns. We also, I think, outside of Soviet-US competition, many people in our community know little about the events of the broader Cold War, particularly those in which there was US involvement. So I would ask first, if you could just tell us what happened in Brazil in 1964.
Thanks, Emerson. I'd like to greet everyone and thank the Atlantic Council and the team of Digital Forensic Research Lab for the invitation. I feel honored to be here sharing this panel with so special researchers. So let's revisit what happened in my country. Brazil was under a military dictatorship for 21 years between 1964 and 1985. The 1964 coup was the result of a great alliance between the military, business, civil society sectors. It was also the result of an anti-communist campaign financed by institutions such as IPES and IBAD, which received support from churches, the Brazilian Lawyers Association, and the Brazilian Press Association. Most newspapers at that time didn't hide their appreciation for the conservative ideology. During the dictatorship, the dictator changed electoral rules. National Congress was closed and reopened several times. There was an information control system to censor, watch over, and persecute opponents. Political persecution, torture, kidnappings, and murders. Almost all the mainstream media outlets gave support to the interruption of the constitutional order and continued to support military leaders. However, the attitude of the press has also changed over the time. It's important to emphasize that the Brazilian authoritarian process stimulated the wave of coup d'etat in Latin America, Bolivia in 1964, Peru in 1968, Ecuador in 1972, Chile and Uruguay in 1973, and Argentina in 1976. Meanwhile, associations among Latin authoritarian regimes went beyond the American continent during the Cold War times. recent research demonstrates that US support for authoritarianism has provided common practice of repression in Latin America and Indonesia, for instance. But regarding that scenario, I believe my colleague, Dr. Baskara Wardaya, can contribute more than I.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanglard. And now to turn to you, Dr. Baskara. Dr. Sanglard went through a list of events that happened concurrent to the coup in Brazil, but of which Indonesia is also a critical piece. So if you could tell us what happened in your country.
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Brooking, and hello, everybody. Thank you also for Dr. Sanglard, who gave us an overview of what happened in Brazil, which actually more or less similar to what happened in Indonesia the following year, which was 1965. For this part of our conversation, I have three points to offer to you. Number one, about what happened in Indonesia was that on October 1st, 1965, 6 high-ranking officers of the Indonesian Army's top leadership were kidnapped and murdered. Then, before the circumstances of the murders were clear, an army officer by the name of Major General Suharto declared that the Indonesian Communist Party was the main perpetrator or the main culprit behind the officers' murders. This declaration, or maybe in our term, animated lies, if you will, or hoax, was subsequently used as a pretext to justify at least 5 things. Number one, the mass killings of hundreds of thousands, probably 1 million, like what Mr. Brooking was saying. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Number two, the declaration or animated lies were also used to for the torturing and detention of many more people, and then the banning of the Indonesian Communist Party. And number 4, the overthrow of President Sukarno, the legal president of Indonesia of the time. And last but not least, it was also used as a pretext or a reason for the rule of the self-declared quote-unquote new order government under General Suharto. That's point number 1. Point number 2, with regard to the Cold War, the context, like what Dr. Sanglard was also saying, the mass killings took place in the midst of the Cold War, in which the United States, Soviet Union or USSR, and People's Republic of China all wanted to have the so-called spheres of influence in Indonesia. Then, just like in Brazil, the US was using anti-communism as a means to destroy the Indonesian Communist Party and all the leftist movements and ideas, as well as to remove the Soviet Union and China from being obstacles in the American hold of on Indonesia. And then the last point, point number 3, is that to a certain degree, there were connections between what happened in Brazil in 1964 with what happened in Indonesia in 1965, and also with what happened in Latin America in general, beginning in the early 1970s, exactly like what Dr. Sanglard was just saying. The use of the term Operação Jakarta or Jakarta Operation in Brazil, or Jakarta Viene or Jakarta is coming in Chile, some of the indications of the connections between what happened in Indonesia, what happened in Brazil, and also what happened in South and Central America. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And 2 things just immediately stand out in these first answers. First, the speed with which social democracy could change thanks to this disinformation campaigns, and then two, the international aspects, how one such movement fueled others. So now, Dr. Stanley, I'd love to turn to you. You've written extensively on sort of the philosophy and language of fascism, and more broadly, how these movements arise and then how they succeed. So I welcome your insight on that critical question.
Great. So we began with Dr. Sanglard talking about the importance of knowing history, and you introducing this in terms of that frame, the importance of knowing history. So what is the importance of knowing history? Well, the importance of knowing history is we can't a priori know what dangerous frames that enable mass violence against by the state are. We can't really know that. It's not a priori. There's no algorithm that tells us what attracts people to mass violence. People resonate with frames with which they're familiar. And as Dr. Wardaya and Sanglard's comments show us, there's a particular frame that has been operative and is familiar to people. And people use those frames. That's what they do. So we've got these frames lying around, and they're familiar from the Cold War. And they were used in the Cold War to target certain populations. What those populations are differ from country to country. So we need to look at history. That's the first, that's point number one. You cannot get a bunch of Silicon Valley people together without knowing history and understand which frames resonate with people. The general frame of the communists have dominated or have taken over your media and your institutions. They're corrupting your children. That's a frame that history tells us is powerful. And it's a frame we're seeing again. Now, what do we learn from the two commentaries that we've just heard? I think we learn the lesson that I personally got out of that is the importance of stressing continuities. The Cold War frame, Cold War liberalism is sometimes contrasted with what we see now. What happened, the genocide in Indonesia, because that's what it was a genocide. Let's remind ourselves that Raphael Lemkin wanted to call mass killings of political minorities, for people for their political views, genocide, but Stalin said no because he was afraid of being criticized for genocide. So the genocide, but there's no good grounds for that. The genocide in Indonesia and the killings, the mass killings by the Brazilian dictatorship in Argentina, Chile, throughout the Cold War were caused by Cold War liberalism and the United States and anti-communism gone awry. So now we have this kind of marriage, it seems to me, between that kind of anti-communism that can be locally very deadly. It's locally used to spread this kind of fear. It's a frame that's used to spread this kind of fear. But in the current moment, it's not connected to something like a Cold War, or is it? It's hard to tell. It's hard for me to tell. The frames, and I'll just end by talking about what about the frames themselves? The frames seem the frame of the communists are coming, they're gonna take your house, they're gonna steal everything, they're in cahoots with the minorities, the feminists, the gender ideologues, the trans women. They've dominated your institutions with the gay agenda. That current structure we're seeing in India, in Brazil, all across Europe with Vox, from Vox to AfD to FPO in Austria, where I am now. That frame can be extremely anti-democratic and dangerous. It's what that kind of, it works to generate a moral panic. In the United States, the critical race theory, attack on critical race theory as linked to Marxism has worked. It has resonance. And so I think we need to be, I'll just end by saying, what does it mean that it's not connected with the Cold War? And we have to reflect that these sort of panics about communist takeover have resulted in genocidal consequences. Thank you.
Dr. Stanley, I'd love to stay with you a moment. As you talk about framing, it sounds like a process that unfolds slowly, then all at once. But I'm curious, in your view, what makes this sort of anti-communist frame so enduring and powerful? Because if we look to the present day, to these conversations of Antifa that began in the far right, really concurrent with President Trump's election in the United States, which have spread to Europe. We've seen examples in Turkey, even in Japan, of Antifa as a new villain. What makes this threat so compelling for people who are vulnerable to supporting these movements?
So we have something of an international playbook here that's happening. Vox in Spain is a good example of that international playbook. They're an entirely concocted right-wing, far-right party that just puts together these elements. So we have this playbook happening, and the playbook, and as Dr. Sanglard said, we have this structuring of the worrisome thing is that the business and the military get behind the sort of people scaremongering about a communist threat that you need to be protected from. That structure where you can say to the dominant group, you're under risk. You're under risk from these minorities, from the leftists. Democracy is enabling these leftists. Democracy is enabling them to come to take over. They're so scary that you need us to protect you. That's the frame to hand over democracy to an authoritarian regime. And what we have is we have a lot of police officers. We have a lot of in many countries, Brazil, the United States, part of that frame. And I guess what makes it resonant, it's resonant. I think Dr. Wardaya explained why it's resonant in multiple countries. One reason is the Cold War. And so institutions that fanned the Cold War have some responsibility here. But we have this anti-communist frame, and it operates really bizarrely, because if you look at Russia, they are both being extremely ethno-nationalist, but playing around with their own past in weird ways.
Well, thank you. So I want to turn back the clock again. And first to you, Dr. Sanglard. It wasn't illegal to be a communist in Brazil before 1964. In fact, there were socialist democratic movements and parties and governments. So I'm curious, after 64, after that coup, how did things change? How was history rewritten such that something that was part of the political mainstream, but a few years before became something forbidden and even something deadly to associate oneself with?
Thanks for the question. Oh, I was taking advantage of the answer of Professor Stanley to say a curiosity about Brazilian dictatorship, because here the military never admitted to having carried out a coup d'etat, but rather supported a revolution. In this discursive dispute, they don't say military dictatorship or authoritarian regime, usually using the expression military government or military regime. So the military used it to say they had built the democracy and the opposition were the threat. So I think all over the world, history is often told by the powerful, the victors, and the dominant groups. Breaking this logic is very difficult. Therefore, memories of historic episodes are always in dispute and negotiation. In the Brazilian case, memories of the colonial past, slavery, and the dictatorship were for a long time guided by the hegemonic thinking of conservative groups. Birth Commission and social movements play an important role in reversing this process while giving voice to minorities, how such victims, poor people, Blacks, women, among other groups that didn't have the chance to speak up. Although our transitional justice process is slightly different from other countries, since restoration policies were developed first and memory and truth policies only after, we have many problems until today. According to the United Nations Development Program, Brazil is the 8th most unequal country in the world, and also one of those with the highest media concentration. Therefore, you are a country that has the challenge of conquering a diversity of perspectives. Thus, it's relatively easy for authorities to obscure the facts behind the siege of power. About the dictatorship today, we have a lot of research on the subject. Schools have a more critical perspective about what happened, and society has some consensus to defend the democracy and not authoritarianism. However, some big lies or myths about the dictatorship keep being reproduced. I will only disprove a few for you. The militaries articulated the coup among with sector of civil society. So the coup was not just military. The coup plotters pretended the president, João Goulart, had left the country, promoted the vacancy of the opposition, which was a lie. The military claimed that it was not a dictatorship because the presidents alternated. It's not the same way of Chile, for instance. However, elections were indirect and only military dictators were elected. The authoritarian government has always denied torture, kidnapping, and murder, although truth commissions have proven that it happened. They created expressions in Portuguese, dita branda, the misleading idea that the Brazilian dictatorship would have been milder than Argentina or Chile. The economic miracle is another misconception because it favored only the richest groups. Brazilian truth commissions estimate that around 8,000 indigenous people and more than 1,000 rural workers have died because of the dictatorship. Despite this, the official number of deaths and missing people only counts 434 people, most of whom were linked to urban movements in opposition to dictatorship. So, denialism, therefore, has been an important element. Some political groups, especially those linked to the military, have always denied that the dictatorship ever exists. It seems absurd because we have evidence that Brazil faced a dictatorial regime, but they insist to be deniers and continue on producing disinformation. And these revisionist movements became stronger after President Bolsonaro took office. Today, Brazil faces one of the most intense political crises in its Republican history, with the growth of extreme right-wing groups and acts of intolerance. Bolsonaro publicly defended the practice of military dictatorship, in which thousands of opponents of the regime were persecuted, assassinated, kidnapped, and tortured. Bolsonaro said he didn't believe in the investigations done by the National Truth Commission, a state agency that investigated human rights violations that occurred during the dictatorship. He also paid homage to Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, a no agent of repression and torture, as previously recognized by the state. Yesterday, we have the first condemned sentences by the judgment in Brazil to condemn a torture for in criminal justice, because until today in Brazil, we just could be a process in civil courts. It's absurd. Bolsonaro's controversial statements and disinformation have been identified as high risk for encouraging extremism, denial, and international politicians and human rights organizations such as Amnesty International have criticized Brazil's incendiary positions in this area.
Thank you, Dr. Sanglard. And it's extraordinary to hear, especially about the sort of through lines, the way that disinformation spread in the 1960s can continue to reverberate or even fuel the rise of new leaders. So, Dr. Baskara, I want to turn next to you to speak too about this issue of historical revisionism. Because the fact is that President Sukarno, who was president of Indonesia for a decade or more preceding the 65 coup and subsequent massacres, he was a socialist. Indonesia was a thriving social democracy. So I'm curious, how did things change so quickly? How did people who were participating in political society just a few years prior, how were they prescribed and then facing dire threats to their lives?
Yeah, that's a very good question, but I don't know if I'm able to answer properly or even perfectly, because it's still so many things that we don't know yet, even up to today. But yeah, Mr. Brooking, you're right that Sukarno was here we call it leftist, but maybe for in our term is a pro people leader. He was for the people. He was loved by the people. He was kind of pro or supporting land reform and things like that. And he wanted to make the Indonesian riches in terms of natural resources for the Indonesians themselves. But then there are two things on that note. Number one was since he was working for the people, he was supported by many leftists in Indonesia, and many of them were members of the Communist Party or more or less supporting the Indonesian Communist Party. And number two, exactly because he wanted to keep the natural resources for the Indonesians themselves, he was disliked by many more or less capitalist nations of the world, Western nation, and also probably Japan and other some Asian countries, I don't know. So that's why there was a little collaboration between the forces of the right in Indonesia, especially among the Indonesian army, and also the forces of people who envied, who were eager to control the Indonesian natural resources, be it timber or oil or rubber, and especially for one of the largest gold deposits in the world, which was located in West Papua. So because of that, there were efforts from inside the country, but also from outside the country for two things. Number one, to destroy the leftist movement. And number two, to remove President Sukarno from power. And then number three, to replace him with more or less US friendly new government. And that's what happened in 1965. And that's what happened after 1965. Indonesia was like, in overnight, it changed into from one country into another, from a country that was trying to be socialist, to be serving its own people, to be independent, became kind of a country that was pro-West, in which the natural resources were exploited by foreign companies, including the gold mines in West Papua, and also the whole economic system became more or less capitalist system until today. And I want to underline what Dr. Stanley was saying, that he emphasized the importance of history, and precisely because of that, then the Suharto government, the New Order government, seized or controlled the narrative, the history of what happened in the past. And what happened next was more or less like what happened in Brazil. Maybe, I don't know, it's to a larger degree, more victims and things like that, but more or less very similar to what happened in Brazil, just like what Dr. Sanglard was sharing with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And so, Dr. Stanley, we have a question from the audience first for you. As we talk about the sort of the permanence of these Cold War frames, especially the fears stoked of communist and socialist movements, an audience member wonders what connections there might be between these sorts of frames and in the US today, alongside these frames, a sort of racial animus that is increasingly stoked in the country. If you see some connection there. And then I have a second question for you. Actually, sorry, please go ahead.
Okay, let me start with that. Well, it's a reiteration of the past. The America during its Cold War heights was suppressing Black movements for equality by linking them to communism. Martin Luther King was said to be a communist, which is ironic given the use the right wing is making of him now. Every Black movement for equality was connected with communism, just like now they are connecting Black movements for equality with communism. That's how it's always going to be in the United States. And in India, it will always be slightly different. It'll be, Dalits and Muslims. And our historical, Black Americans, something horrible, there was a horrible injustice done to them, and very little structurally is being done to change that. And you can get white Americans to be terrified of such structural changes. So in the face of such structural changes, you say the strategy is this. You say, democracy is a zero-sum game. And you, the dominant group, are gonna lose because the minority groups are gonna come get theirs and they're gonna seize power from you. And then furthermore, you dominant groups also know the kind of terrible things you did to get that house and that second home. So you can make people afraid. So these are there's specificity to the United States, but the denialism, all the themes that we're talking about here of history denialism, they're happening now with our laws against critical race theory, banning the 1619 Project. You want to deny those aspects of our past that are racist, namely many aspects of every institution, so that you don't have to change them, so you can continue who's in power and who's not.
Thank you.
Just a comment on Lula and Sukarno. I mean, Sukarno, what Dr. Baskara described as Sukarno seems to me what happened to Lula in Brazil. Like, he was too successful of a left-wing leader.
Yes.
And so, Dr. Stanley, to stay with you, we are at an event of the Digital Forensic Research Lab, so we do need to talk briefly about the internet. I'm curious, first to you, but then I'll pose the same question to our other panelists as well. How does the modern internet, how does the speed and immediacy of social media, how does it change the sorts of dynamics that we're discussing? Do we think that the internet enables citizens to be more resistant to these sorts of movements? Do they come on faster? Are they as enduring with the speed of communication we have today? But I'd welcome your thoughts. First, Dr. Stanley.
Let me begin. Here again, we see how important history is. Dr. Baskara is describing one of the worst genocides of humanity, the massacre of 1 million suspected communists in a very short time, like a year or two, right? And so less. So that's 1 million people. That was well before the internet. The Brazilian. So there's a temptation to say it's special, and there are certain features that are special, but it's because we can those are the tractable features. The untractable features are the fact that we have these deep-seated narratives from our recent history that can be exploited in various ways.
Dr. Sanglard? Do you, the role of social media and the internet, do you think that it makes citizenry today more resilient to these sorts of movements, or does it have the opposite effect?
Can I answer?
Oh, please, yes.
No, okay. Oh, I think this idea of moral panic brought by Dr. Stanley works very well to Brazil. And we have some comments about the early studies of the internet that were very positive about the democratic potential. Over time, we understood that this whole expansion carries romanticism in the same way that the experience allows many advances, connections, new modes of interaction and political participation. The internet also promotes asymmetries and reproduces inequalities. Social media platforms in particular have helped to connect people and share content, but they have also propelled and the creation of bubbles. Of course, I think it's easier today to have access to all kinds of information about the history of past authoritarian regimes for anywhere in the world. It's all easier to collect that data to researchers. But the question is, what is being done with so much information, with confusion, with disinformation and misinformation? How do we deal with those who only have access to their own bubble information? I don't see a more democratic path if you only think about how to contain this information. I will not come to an end just because we want it to or because you know it's undemocratic potential. Rumors and big lies have always existed and have always been used as a political tool. The main issue today is a distinct phenomenon, and that materializes in misinformation or disinformation. And I think this phenomenon is more complex because it's social, it's political, but it's also communication. It's a digital phenomenon of the mediatized society. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Baskara, the same. From your perspective, how does the internet change the dynamics you've spent your career studying?
Yes, thank you for the question. Probably I just continue what Dr. Sanglard was saying. To me, the internet, from my observation, like a two-edged sword. It's a positive side and negative side. On the negative side, again, it's creating inequality and things like that among the society. But on the other hand, with regard to the narratives of the 1965 violence in Indonesia, the internet has been used or utilized by young Indonesians to counter the culture of denial, the culture of big lies and things like that, by publishing books or making documentary films or having forums and things like that, and all are intended to counter the big lies, the untruths that had been told for more than three or 4 or 5 decades. So in that sense, the internet is very good now in the hands of young people in terms of resistance, but also fighting against the culture of big lies and denial.
Thank you, Dr. Baskara. And we have about 3 minutes left. This time for one more question with a quick answer from each, which will also be your closing statements. Dr. Baskara, I want to stay with you. I want to pose the same question again to each of you. We see today what seemed to be a new spell of big lies spread around the world. A number of once democratic states that now today seem less free. So I'm curious, if you are speaking to young people today, what advice would you have for navigating this world of big lies and trying to find the truth as one can? And first to you, Dr. Baskara.
Okay, for me, I want to say two things. Number one, study all those big lies. You know, read books or information about those big lies. And number two, counter those big lies with truth, with a well-researched statement and things like that, and use the internet to share what you know, to share what you learn, to share what you experience in order to advance justice, truth, and also reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sanglard?
Thanks. Oh, we identified that our democratic process is not linear. It's closer to a cycle. So we have times of recession and backlash open democracy. And I think we have the same, there's no doubt achievements are under threat. So I think we need to combat the fire with disinformation, but not so much. We need more literacy, media criticism, and I don't know, we need to know why is, how is responsible for producing this information, and who are the main consumers, how do they share them, how do digital platforms contribute to information, not only for the dictatorships, but the pandemic too. I think it's my answer.
Well, thank you very much. And the last word to you, Dr. Stanley, in the few seconds we have left. What do we do?
Got it. So first of all, progress is not linear. We should take heart in the fact that we've been here before. These attacks on democracy, Cold War liberalism was implicated deeply in attacks on democracy, as the two examples we've seen have shown. So we have to make something new, something that's not Cold War liberalism and something that's not ethno-nationalism. And we should do that by our commitment, joint commitment to democracy.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our participants today and to our audience. Take care. It was wonderful to have you.